Hello everyone, I'm Ron Jones. The world is pausing to remember the life and legacy of former President Jimmy Carter. The longest living president died peacefully Sunday at his home in Plains, Georgia, surrounded by his family. He was 100 years old. The Carter Center announced his death just after 4 o'clock, honoring the former president's, quote, long life of selfless service that left a lasting mark on the world. Condolences pouring in for the 39th president, from President Joe Biden to the King Center and beyond. And we are honoring the former president with a look back on his life, his legacy, and the impact on this nation.
Although Plains, Georgia has made its mark as the birthplace and home of Jimmy Carter, the boy who grew up to become president actually spent his formative years in a place even smaller than Plains, 2 miles away in an unincorporated and predominantly black community called Archery.
During the dry season, when we were cultivating crops and planting and cultivating and harvesting, we were extremely busy in the field. And Daddy was a very good taskmaster. He taught me the benefits of hard work.
Daddy was Earl Carter, a larger-than-life farmer who successfully ran a country store in Archery and an agricultural warehouse in downtown Plains. Mama was Lillian Carter, a spirited woman who worked as a small-town nurse. When he graduated from Plains High School, Jimmy Carter went to a community college in nearby Americus, then Georgia Tech. But Earl Carter wanted his son to go to the Naval Academy, and 2 years later, Carter received a wartime appointment. It put Jimmy Carter in U.S. Navy submarines and sent him around the world. He would marry Rosalind Smith, a hometown girl who grew up just a few doors away from the Carter family. A few years later, Carter returned home and entered the world of politics. His first victory was a state Senate seat.
I was able to get a 4-year college approved in Americus, our county seat, and that got me reelected without any opposition. And then I decided to run for the U.S. Congress against a Republican incumbent, Bo Calloway, who was from West Point, and he was an antagonist of mine in many ways. He withdrew from the congressional race and left me with the congressional race won. I decided he wanted to run for governor. I decided to run for governor against Calloway, so I ran for governor in '66 and lost.
And against Lester Maddox.
And against Lester Maddox.
Lester Maddox was a fiery segregationist who didn't get enough votes to win the election, but became governor after the legislature stepped in. Carter went back to Plains and plotted to run for governor again. It was a race that shook the state in 1970. This time, he won.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter's inauguration speech stunned his listeners, but that speech, as well as his 4 years as governor, gave him a reputation as a new kind of Southern politician.
People were looking for someone that was not from Washington.
Jay Hakes, another early key Carter supporter, was impressed immediately with Carter's command of detail on major issues. Hakes believes it was Carter's status as a Washington outsider and his faith-based ethics that resonated with most voters as he was running for president.
We now have a projected winner in the presidential election. NBC News projects James Earl Carter of the state of Georgia elected the next president of the United States.
When Jimmy Carter brought his good intentions into the White House,
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear that
he began with an ambitious agenda. President Carter attacked the energy crisis, fuel shortages, and rising prices. He created the Department of Energy. He told us we all must do our part.
All of us must learn to waste less energy.
This was the president who, in March of 1979, engineered the Middle East Peace Treaty, just 6 months after the preliminary agreements were first reached at Camp David, one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in U.S. history.
Carter's involvement was very, very necessary, and this brought peace between Egypt and Israel that has lasted to this day.
Jimmy passed more legislation than any president except Lyndon Johnson since the World War II. Good legislation. We're making friends in the world.
Most presidents, after they're done with office, they're playing golf, they're on the lecture circuit sometimes, they serve on corporate boards. He made it a mission to continue what he thought was important to the world.
And what was important? First, fighting for justice.
The most enjoyable and exciting, challenging things are when we break down those barriers and reach out to others.
The Carter Center since 1989 has worked with 38 countries to monitor and ensure fairness in nearly 100 democratic elections. On the other side of the planet, guinea worm disease has affected millions. Carter championed its removal, and in 3 decades, the number of cases dropped to dozens. The only other disease eradicated ever, smallpox. And with every cause, Carter aimed big. In 1976, a humble husband and wife in the humble city of Americus, Georgia, founded a humble nonprofit, Habitat for Humanity. The goal? To build houses for those in need. It remained humble until it courted a former president. His approach to Habitat reflected his outlook overall, affecting the world and never forgetting its roots. It is the strength of a global icon, the strength of a man from Plains, Georgia.
Yearbook pages full of alumni who etched their way into the country's history.
Miller, McKinney, Flanagan.
And former President Jimmy Carter.
There were a number of people who were very close friends with Jimmy Carter. A lot of them worked on his administration, and so a very cohesive class.
Eileen Marusic serves as secretary for the class of 47, collecting and documenting the stories of the men she calls her 47 heart. She took over after her father, Larry Marusic, who also graduated then, passed away.
The best part about taking this was that I was able to channel my dad because they lived the same military experience he lived. And as I see them passing away, it's been joyful, but it's sad.
The ones left living, all at least in their late 90s. Some still remember the midshipman who would go on to be the 39th president of the United States, like class president Jack Stevens, who was in the same cutter crew as Jimmy Carter. A cutter's a type of boat.
And people ask, well, how was he? Well, he was absolutely non-demanding. Of course, he hadn't been president at that time either, but he was easy to get along with, a neat wife.
Joe Flanagan, who wrestled at the academy and served in the Navy for years, remembers taking classes with Jimmy Carter.
He was always a straight shooter, and I enjoyed his company. A lot smarter than I was in math and the sciences, but I was way ahead of him in English and literature.
He also worked on Carter's presidential campaign, as did Bob McKinney, who didn't get to know the future president and his wife Rosalind until after graduation. Jimmy Carter asked him to serve as chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board when he was elected president.
They're wonderful people.
McKinney and his wife even traveled with the Carters to China.
He wore the hell out of you. He was a very active guy. He swam every morning, so that's what kept him healthy. And he gave 3 talks a day while he was over there. And he wore me out just following him around.
From sea to presidency, Academy alums have long been Carter's crewmates.
I feel like it's been an honor to know these men.
An honor to share these pages with each other and Jimmy Carter.
This is good barbecue, isn't it?
In 1962, a stylish and progressive Augusta Democrat named Carl Sanders was plotting a run for governor of Georgia. Meanwhile, in South Georgia, another Democrat was plotting his first run for political office. Jimmy Carter had his eye on the state Senate.
The reason he got into that race in '62 was, by that point, you knew Carl Sanders was going to be the next governor. It was a fresh face, kind of Kennedy-esque was the way Sanders was often described. And Carter says he wanted to be part of that. He thought that would be exciting to go to the legislature at that time.
And when the 1962 election came around, there was a threat of closing the public school system if one classroom was integrated. In fact, our #1 candidate for governor, Ernest Vandiver, who was a very fine man, would hold up one finger and said, "No, not one." So I thought, in my idealistic way, I would go to the Senate and protect the public school system from closing down and let them be racially integrated. And so that's why I ran for the Senate.
But Carter's first political race got caught in the crosshairs of a corrupt political kingpin from Quitman County named Joe Hearst. Hearst backed Homer Moore, Carter's opponent. And when the ballots came back from Quitman County, Carter appeared to lose the election.
This boss in Quitman County, and Georgia still had a number of counties where boss controlled them, had packed the ballot box.
They were brought in, tied up, and they were in alphabetical order, and some of the people that had voted were already dead. It was pretty flagrant that there had been phony ballots put in the box.
Carter and his backers complained to authorities in Quitman County who did nothing. So Carter talked to reporters in Atlanta who smelled a story and beat the drum about the crooked county that stole the election.
It was pretty flagrant that the person who had voted just before the polls closed said, "I was number 332 or something like this, and there were 1 or 2 people after me," and yet when they counted the ballots, there were over 420 of them. So, yeah.
Hearst eventually went to prison while Jimmy Carter went to Atlanta and took his seat in the state Senate. He became known as a detail-oriented freshman who backed education funding but otherwise kept his head down. 2 years later, he won re-election unopposed.
I was able to get a 4-year college approved in Americus, our county seat, and that got me reelected without any opposition. And then I decided to run for the U.S. Congress against a Republican incumbent, Bo Calloway, who was from West Point, and he was an antagonist of mine in many ways. He withdrew from the congressional race and left me with the congressional race won. I decided he wanted to run for governor. I decided to run for governor against Calloway, so I ran for governor in '66 and lost.
And against Lester Maddox.
And against Lester Maddox.
Lester Maddox was a fiery segregationist who didn't get enough votes to win the election, but became governor after the legislature stepped in. Carter went back to Plains and plotted to run for governor again. It was a race that shook the state in 1970.
It was a very ugly race.
Carter's opponent was former Governor Carl Sanders, who had established himself as an integrationist at a time when racial politics were still incendiary in Georgia and in much of the South.
Segregation now!
In the presidential election 2 years earlier, Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace, won Georgia's electoral votes.
And so in 1970, when Carter runs for governor, he runs as the Wallace candidate. And he runs saying, if I'm elected governor, I'll invite George Wallace to come over. I'll put him up in the governor's mansion.
Now, was Carter running as the Wallace candidate, or did he pay lip service to Wallace just enough to try to win some votes from those type of folks?
Yeah, I mean, there was a very strong anti-Washington, anti-desegregation, anti-civil rights element in the Georgia electorate at that point, and Carter was appealing to that, and Sanders was not, so they had a clear divide there.
That year, leaflets circulated linking Carl Sanders with African Americans, including Martin Luther King Jr. Carter's campaign denied producing them. In 2014, Judy Woodruff asked President Carter about the 1970 race.
You didn't run as a segregationist, certainly, but you sent some signals that you were welcoming to people who were in favor of segregation.
Well, the vast majority of Georgian voters were in favor of segregation, and I didn't want to say anybody who has been a segregationist don't vote for me. So I was searching for votes among all the people of Georgia, whether they were integrationists, which were very rare back in those days, or the vast majority who were basically segregationists, yes. But I never appealed in any way to racial animosity or racial segregation. in my campaign.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
And I expressed my views quite clearly on Inauguration Day.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter's inauguration speech stunned his listeners. But that speech, as well as his 4 years as governor, gave him a reputation as a new kind of Southern politician.
President Carter told me one time the best job he ever had was governor of Georgia. He always revered the time he was governor. He made a lot of changes when he was governor. Reorganized the state, zero-based budgeting, all these things that are buzzwords today first came from Jimmy Carter when he was governor of the state. It was very progressive.
It was a reputation that took root nationally in the 1970s.
Jimmy Carter is as much defined by his later years when he became a global icon.
I think he redefined a post-presidency in a fundamental way. There's no question that his post-presidency has been enormously successful in a way that you could never say about the period that he was president.
Any discussion begins at the Carter Center, a base for humanitarian efforts worldwide. The Carter Center, since 1989, has worked with more than 36 countries to monitor and ensure fairness in more than 100 democratic elections.
He's flown around the world. He has been involved in ongoing dialogues with different countries.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
That has been a tremendous public service.
The former president paired human rights campaigns with programs for health. On the other side of the planet, guinea worm disease has affected millions. Carter championed its removal, and in 3 decades, the number of cases has dropped to less than 5.
We believe that we now have assurance of enough funds to completely eradicate the disease from the face of the earth.
The Carter Center has also made efforts against river blindness, trachoma, and a host of ailments affecting every continent. In 2002, that work was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
In 1976, a humble husband and wife in the humble city of Americus, Georgia, founded a humble nonprofit, Habitat for Humanity. The goal, to build houses for those in need. It remained humble until it courted a former president.
I'm not sure you or anyone else would have heard of Habitat if it had not been for the Carters getting involved in 1984.
His approach to Habitat reflects his outlook overall, affecting the world, but never forgetting its roots.
A global icon, a champion for justice, a dedicated public servant who never forgot his roots.
You know, I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence.
James Earl Carter Jr. was born in Plains, Georgia in 1924. When he graduated from Plains High School, Carter went to a community college before joining the U.S. Naval Academy. And 2 years later, he received a wartime appointment serving on Navy submarines around the world. But Carter's heart was in his home state, and his love was in his hometown. In 1946, he married Rosalind Smith, a young woman who grew up just a few doors down from the Carter family.
The best thing that ever happened to me was marrying Rosalind.
After serving in the Navy, Carter went back to Georgia and entered the world of politics. First, a victory in the state Senate, then a U.S. congressional race. He lost his first campaign for governor, but not the second time.
I promise you my best. I ask of you your best.
In 1970, Carter was elected Georgia governor, and the next 4 years gave him a reputation as a new kind of Southern politician.
NBC News projects James Earl Carter of the state of Georgia elected the next president of the United States.
A reputation that helped propel him into the Oval Office.
I told you I didn't intend to lose.
1976, President-elect Jimmy Carter.
We must act now, together, to devise and to implement a comprehensive national energy plan.
He began with an ambitious agenda. President Carter attacked the energy crisis, fuel shortages, and rising prices. He created the Department of Energy, and in 1979, engineered the Camp David Accords, bringing peace to the Middle East, one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in U.S. history.
During the past 30 years, Israel and Egypt have waged war. But for the past 16 months, these same two great nations have waged peace. The 1980s have been born in turmoil.
Later that year, though, the most profound crisis of Carter's presidency, when Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American hostages.
We've imposed economic sanctions, and we have broken diplomatic relations with Iran.
The ordeal lasted 444 days. It ended hours after newly elected President Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. After leaving office, Carter's dedication to public service and public good continued.
How many officials? Staff.
Since 1989, the Carter Center has worked with 38 countries to monitor and ensure fairness in nearly 100 democratic elections. He's helped to eradicate disease.
It's a very gratifying and heartbreaking, but also heartwarming experience.
And well into his 90s, humbly helped build homes for those in need with Habitat for Humanity.
I think I have been as blessed as any human being in the world.
The office of President of the United States.
Become the President of the United States of America and Governor of Georgia and work at the Carter Center and a big and growing family and thousands of friends. So I've had, everything's been a blessing for me.
President Jimmy Carter, a global icon, a champion for justice, a dedicated public servant who never forgot his roots.